Hello. Okay. Um, awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the waiting room. My name is Casey, and I want to talk to you about DC hardcore. This is my first episode of this show. I'm very very excited. And um, the hardcore scene that came out of Washington D.C. in primarily the 80s is just one of my favorite things to just yap about. So when the time came to when the time came to discuss like what do I want to do for my first episode, this was the first thing I thought of. So um um I my primary aim with this show is to sort of go through a history of um, certain periods of music, certain scenes, and I wanted to start with this one because I grew up in the DC area, and I didn't really have a lot of like pride in growing up in the nation's capital because when I was a teenager I didn't particularly like the country I lived in very much. Um, but I discovered a lot of the music that came out of the scene in the 80s and 90s within the past couple of years, and it gave me a lot of sort of tribalist tendencies, um, because hey, uh, we pioneered hardcore, we pioneered emo, we pioneered post-hardcore, which are like just three of the best genres ever, almost inarguably. So, um, to get started on this sort of timeline of the DC hardcore scene, almost everyone attributes the very beginning of it to have started with the Bad Brains. The Bad Brains started as an all black jazz fusion band in 1976 called Mind Power. Um, and in 1977, um, their singer at the time, Sid, introduced the other members to this brand new phenomenon that was happening in certain parts of the English speaking world, primarily the east coast of the U.S. and the U.K. The Ramones and the Sex Pistols were starting to gain major traction, and there was sort of a subculture starting to be built around it. Um, and so the guys in this band Mind Power heard about this, and after a while, they sort of made it their life's mission to essentially play as fast and as loud as humanly possible. And that was sort of how hardcore was born. A lot of people attribute the Bad Brains to be the first um, hardcore band. The hardcore sort of spawned in several different places at the same time because it wasn't Reagan was in office. People were really mad, and it wasn't that big of a logical leap to go from hey, let's make music where we're really mad at the government to hey, let's make music where we're really mad at the government um and be really really fast about it. So, Black Flag popped up in the West. They toured all over the place. They sort of left seeds wherever they went for future bands. A lot of people attribute them as a huge contributor to the genre. But the Bad Brains were, I think, arguably more influential because the East Coast ended up being um, the sort of catalyst for a huge explosion of hardcore music on the East Coast. So, um, their the first song on their EP, or no, it's actually a full album. Um, their first release, self-titled Bad Brains, which is attributed to be their best, um, is called Sailin' On, and that's what I'm going to play right now because that's my favorite song by them. Okay. And that was Sailin' On by the Bad Brains. Essentially, like, the whole deal with the Bad Brains and why they were so explosive and influential at the time was because you sort of have to understand how novel this sound was. No one, I believe there's a Guinness World Record book from, I can't remember exactly what year, but sometime in the 1980s that cites them as like the fastest band alive. And that's what they were, and they took pride in it, and they were insane. Their vocalist, by the time, they sort of had a lot of ins and outs with the lineup. But their vocalist for the majority of the recording of the music that they're best known for, HR, would do backflips on stage and like physically fight people in the audience. And it sort of fostered this culture around particularly the DC scene, but of course it spread like wildfire. And the Bad Brains also sort of contributed a lot to mosh culture, which also spread a lot in the DC scene, alongside the spread of punk rock. One essential influence that the DC scene, or that the Bad Brains had on the DC scene, rather, is the existence of the teen idols, which are attributed as the first of many bands that cite them as their number one direct influence. Essentially, this teenager named Ian MacKaye, who's like in maybe like 16 at this point when the debut drops in maybe 1979 by the Bad Brains, and he hears this and he's like, I'm gonna do that. And one of the things about hardcore is that it's pretty easy to do once you get the hang of playing that inhumanly fast. You get like 3 or 4 chords, write some angry lyrics. It's pretty easy. It being like complicated is not even close to what makes hardcore so meaningful to so many people. And it was particularly meaningful to Ian MacKaye. So when the Teen Idols formed, Ian MacKaye was on bass initially, and they just started playing as fast as possible and writing these like songs that were incredibly influential. But you listen to them and you're like, okay, there's room for improvement. But I kind of love them for what they are. They're just a bunch of teenagers screwing around, and you know what? I love it for what it is. So this is I Drink Milk by the Teen Idols from the Flex Your Head comp. That was I Drink Milk by the Teen Idols, and I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about when I say it's just kind of teenagers screwing around. If you weren't able to make out a single line in that entire song, you are not alone. Um, Most of what they say is I drink milk, I don't care what people say, I drink milk for vitamin A, which is just awesome. And definitely a sentiment that I can imagine teenagers having in the 1980s. Particularly because the reputation of the teen idols as these kids that were entering a very drug heavy scene, the punk scene, was very like it was very inextricably tied to drug use, particularly heroin, particularly weed. Lots of drinking happened at shows. People got rowdy. And they sort of did this brand new thing where they were like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put X's on my hands so everyone knows that I'm not drinking in this club. And I'm going to take a stand. And that was like primarily in Makai's game. He was never particularly interested in things that his peers were interested in, particularly when it came to things like drugs and alcohol. And when it came time to form his bands, he made that a huge centerpiece of what he wanted to communicate to his fans and the world at large. That will come to be more of a prominent feature in his later band, which we'll get to in just a minute. Next, we have Blackout by SOA, which stands for State of Alert. They were formed shortly after the Teen Idols because Henry Garfield, later to be known as Henry Rollins when he joins Black Flag, probably one of the most famous people to have been sort of born and bred in the DC scene. After the formation of the Teen Idols, Henry was like, I want to get in on this. So he formed State of Alert with some of his friends from this other band called the Untouchables after it dissolved. You'll come to notice that a lot of DC bands don't last very long. Their shelf life is like maybe average of 2 years, and a lot of them like don't even last a year, which we'll totally get to. Plenty of those that sort of put out one release and then just fell into dust. But State of Alert was another pretty popular feature in the DC scene once they got started. Fun fact, they practiced on the vice president's property fairly often because I believe the guitarist's father worked for his estate, and so they would like be escorted onto the property by like Secret Service, literally, and like play their shitty hardcore music in the basement with all these like Secret Service agents around, and that mental image is hilarious to me. So my favorite SOA song is Blackout, and here it is. For those keeping score, that song was 44 seconds. So a big feature of playing songs as fast as possible is being able to fit 2 choruses and 2 verses into a song that is less than a minute. And that would continue to be a pretty prominent pattern in future hardcore music to come. So that was released in 1981. Henry would, that same year, fly across the country to become the new vocalist in Black Flag. So while he was off doing that, the Teen Idols dissolved because their lead singer got a girlfriend who was a born-again Christian, and she sort of, taught him everything she knew, and he all of a sudden was sort of very anti the punk thing. And Ian was really upset about it, so he picked his shit up, got out of there, formed a new band with a new lineup, including Jeff Nelson from the Teen Idols. Him and Ian would play in almost every band that either of them were in up until my favorite DC band, which we'll get to in a little while. And that band that Ian formed in 1980, I believe, was called Minor Threat. And they are the most, I would say, well-known band to come out of the DC scene, and maybe hardcore in general, at least that sort of breed of hardcore from the 80s, like the sort of OG stuff. They released 2 EPs from 1980 to 1981, and then I believe their most iconic, like wonderful release was called Out of Step, and it's I believe 16-minute EP, in which among other things, Ian, who is now on vocals as opposed to bass, which he was playing in the Teen Idols, sings about his quarrels with social issues. Keep in mind, he's still like maybe 19, 20 at this point. People in the DC scene formed bands when they were very young, barely knew how to play. Brian Baker, the bassist of Minor Threat, who eventually turned into the guitarist after they picked up a new member, was, I believe, 14 or 15 when the band was formed, and that makes me feel great about myself and my musical prospects. So, my favorite Minor Threat song is Betray, the first song on Out of Step. So, here we go. That was Betray by Minor Threat. Another big thing about, I mentioned that, that they were very sort of close-knit, but, like, they were very specifically, like, quite exclusive to, and sort of protective of their scene. The formation of Discord Records, which was formed by Ian MacKaye and Jeff Nelson, members of the Teen Idols, in order to release the Teen Idols' first EP, they're self-titled. It was an indie label, and they sort of sought out to record and sort of archive a lot of the sounds that were happening in the area. And they wanted to make sure that all of their friends and their friends' bands got their music recorded and heard by anyone who wanted to hear them. So, an interesting exception to the rule of the whole, if you want to be in the DC scene, you got to be from DC rule that was sort of unspoken but generally accepted, is Void, who are one of my favorite inclusions and sort of phenomenons almost. It's almost unfair to call them a band, because they were a unit. They were so strange. They would like play at different tempos in the middle of a song, and it just all comes together in a way that is so fantastic. They were very rough. They were very loud. They were the heaviest band from DC from this period. And they were considered very dangerous, even though all of the members were in high school at the time. I believe they were all around 15 and in Catholic school when this band was formed. And you can kind of understand being Catholic school boys in the 80s, just filled with rage. And this was apparently a very healthy output for them. My favorite part of Void's whole deal is the vocals of one Sir John Waifenbach. I think he's fantastic. I think he's one of the most underrated hardcore vocalists, period. But in spite of comparative unpopularity compared to some of their cohorts, like Minor Threat, they were very influential. Their sound went on to influence a lot of not only DC bands, but hardcore bands across the country. And the release of the Faith Void split on Discord Records in particular proved to be one of the most like influential hardcore releases of all time. And we'll get to Faith in a minute. That's a different discussion. But this is I'm realizing now a lot of the songs that I'm playing happen to be the first songs on their respective projects. Maybe I just tend to prefer opening tracks as a general rule, but this is Who Are You off of Void's half of the Faith Void split. That, my friends, was Who Are You by Void. If you don't get the gist of what Void's whole deal was from that song alone, I don't know what to tell you. I do want to reiterate the fact that they were like 16-year-old Catholic boys. That sounds like the kind of music that angry 16-year-old Catholic boys would make, at least in my book. So the other half of the Faith Void split was by a band called The Faith, obviously. The Faith was formed by Alec Mackay, who was Ian Mackay's brother. They got into punk around the same time, and Alec is actually the face, or the figure, I suppose, on the cover of Minor Threat's first EP. A lot of people think it's Ian because of the bald head, but no, they were just both voluntarily bald at that point. I could not tell you why. It was just what was happening at the time. So the Faith formed shortly after the dissolution of the aforementioned Untouchables, which also led to the formation of SOA. Very tight-knit community. A lot of dissolutions of other bands led to the formation of other bands. It was sort of an in-and-out pull scenario. And the Faith were, oddly enough, Minor Threat has had the by far the largest lasting legacy of the DC scene. But at the time when all this new music was happening, the Faith were actually probably the most popular band in the area. People found their music particularly emotionally impactful, and people just adored them, and they would prove to be very influential in the long run, in the case of certain bands that we will get to in just a moment. So, first, before we get into that, this is It's Time by The Faith. Yet another one that's under a minute long. That was It's Time by The Faith, also known as just Faith. Eventually they dropped the, I believe, at Ian Mackay's suggestion. It's like, just call it Faith, man. If you've been paying attention to the sort of timeline here and sort of evolution of the DC sound, you might notice that Alec Mackay sort of approached the vocals of songs recorded by The Faith with a sort of rough intonation that was not necessarily new in hardcore as a whole, but he also delivers his lyrics with a certain emotional passion, which was kind of a novelty at this point. This is still very early on in hardcore's evolution. This EP was released in 1982, which was, only a couple of years after the Bad Brains started it. And then something very interesting happened about a year later. Minor Threat dissolved. It was just creative differences, by all accounts. Ian was getting frustrated with certain choices by the other band members. Some of the other band members were like, hey man, we don't want to be straight edge. And Ian was pretty pissed about that. But almost like the minute after Minor Threat broke up in 1983, this kid named Guy Picciotto forms a band called Rites of Spring. Now, previously he had played guitar in this other band called Insurrection. They were signed to Discord Records like everyone else and their mother. And they recorded a demo at Inner Ear Records, which was the studio that most people who wanted their punk music to get recorded in the DC area used. But that demo is now completely lost. I think they were literally so embarrassed of it that they just wanted it to go away forever. Which, I mean, I haven't heard it, so, like, I can't judge. But generally, if a band from the DC area, which everyone knows has birthed so many fantastic bands, if a DC band sort of just disappears without really making much of a sound, you probably don't need to listen to them. But you do need to listen to Rites of Spring. Rites of Spring is one of the most important bands that I've ever encountered, and potentially at least top 3, if not top 2, top 1 most influential bands to come out of the DC scene. To put it into perspective, they are cited by most people as the first emo band. When the Revolution Summer was happening at around 1984, summer of 1984 was coined as the Revolution Summer by Discord employee Amy Pickering, who was of the band Fire Party, who are also very good, but we unfortunately will not be hearing from them tonight. So, Revolution Summer is happening after the breakup of Minor Threat. There's sort of a lull in activity in the DC punk scene. And some people, Amy Pickering and Guy Picciotto included, decide to do something about it. And a lot of people formed new bands who were utilizing new ideas, and in an attempt to revitalize the scene. And Rites of Spring is by far, my favorite band to come out of this new crop. And they proved to be incomprehensibly influential to the genesis of emotional hardcore, as Thrasher coined it. And if you shorten that, it becomes emocore, and that's where the term comes from. So, this is Drink Deep from Rites of Spring's self-titled. Let's hear what the OG emo sounded like. That was that was Drink Deep by Rites of Spring. Now, if you're not familiarized with DC hardcore and sort of particularly the early roots of emo music, you might hear something like this and wonder, what is this? Like, what relation does this have to emo music? This just kind of sounds like a punk band or a hardcore band or whatever you want to call it. If you compare to the song we just heard, It's Time by the Faith, there's definitely a sort of progression, and you can definitely hear that Picciotto is influenced by Alec Mackay's vocals, but he sort of approaches it with a new, again, passion. And during live shows, Rites of Spring only ever played 19 shows, and almost all of them were in the DC area. And the reason that they didn't play many shows was because the types of shows that they put on were absolutely exhilarating. They almost always smashed up their instruments by the end, and this wasn't Kurt Cobain type smashing instruments. They didn't have money. They were mostly teenagers. I believe Picciotto was the oldest at 20, and he would just like snap the neck of his Rickenbacker, tear all the strings off of it, and then the show would end, and he'd have to go get it replaced like a normal person. And the other thing is Picciotto, as you just heard, whimpering and wailing, he would sing to the point of absolute exhaustion. And this sound was so novel at the time of Rites of Spring's genesis that like people didn't know what to think when they went to their shows. They would go expecting a hardcore show, expecting violence and anger, and they would get these very introspective songs with very introspective lyrics and very emotional deliveries on Picciotto's part. And according to many, I suppose, reports from what the scene was like at the time, people would go to their shows and be weeping by the end of it. It was that emotionally impactful for these people. And of course, Rites of Spring's influence immediately exploded. People heard them, and they were like, what is this? We need to do this now. Please. And that starts with a few different bands, but the first one I want to cover is another one of my favorites, Grey Matter. They... Excuse me. They form in 1979, start off making pretty standard... I'm sorry, someone is outside of the studio. They start off making pretty standard punk music with a bit of a Beatles flair, ironically. Their first album has a cover of I Am the Walrus that is, I think, not intended to be funny, but is quite funny to me, or at least entertaining. But it is their second album, Take It Back, where they start to really hone in the Rites of Spring influence, and you can really hear it in the guitars and the vocal delivery. And this is sort of, at least for me, where you can start to see the resemblance to emo acts that you might be more familiar with. It quickly evolves from its hardcore punk roots into something entirely new. And a lot of people objected to the emo label. Picciotto famously did not like it. Ian Mackay, who we'll get to in a minute, famously was not a fan of the term emo core. But everyone involved knew that this was something brand new, and I think you'll be inclined to agree. So this is Take It Back by Grey Matter. So you might see what I mean when I say that emo was sort of starting to find itself within hardcore punk. There's more of a focus on melodic guitar lines and introspective lyrics, and a sort of generally emotional approach to the genre that was incredibly novel at the time. And this brings us to Ian MacKay's new band, Embrace, his first band since his first band that played out, at the very least. There were a few one-offs that he and Jeff Nelson participated in the interim period, but he forms Embrace after being incredibly inspired by Rites of Spring, who he produced for. He produced both of their EPs, or their album and their EP. And he's so inspired by this new sound that he, too, participates in what was known as the Revolution Summer. He forms Embrace. They put out, similar to Rites of Spring, a self-titled album, full length, and then they disappear forever. But we'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, here is Spoke by Embrace.
Life goes on, life goes on in the
that was Spoke by Embrace. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you can see how emotion has sort of injected itself into the DC hardcore scene. Suddenly, within the span of like 2 years, everyone sounded like this. Everyone was introspecting. Everyone was sad. And it was an interesting period because very shortly, emo spread like wildfire across the U.S. By the late 80s and early 90s, most people just called it emo as opposed to emo core. Got popular on the West Coast, got popular in the Midwest, which would come to spawn off what people know as Midwest emo. Very popular, very good. And meanwhile, in D.C., once again, because nothing gold can stay, people are already getting disillusioned with the whole deal in the city. There's yet another lull in the performances of certain bands. Embrace eventually dissolves. Guy Picciotto's new band, One Last Wish, has already dissolved. Didn't even get to play them. They didn't last very long, neither did the follow-up, Happy Go Licky, which was the same lineup as Rites of Spring, but with a completely new approach to music. It was so experimental. There were tape loops involved, and they never recorded anything in studio. Their only official release is a live recording that is really bad quality. But if you're in the market for the weirdest post-hardcore album that you've ever heard, check out Will Play by Happy Go Licky. In the meantime, both Guy Picciotto and Ian MacKaye find themselves without bands. And this whole time, they've sort of been indirectly bouncing off of each other. When Minor Threat broke up, Guy Picciotto, who was a huge fan of Minor Threat and was extremely influenced and inspired by them, formed Rites of Spring because they wanted to see new things happening in the DC scene, just like Minor Threat had done a couple years earlier. When Rites of Spring formed, Ian MacKaye forms Embrace because he likes that sound so much. And they're sort of interacting in this way, and they knew each other, but they had never been in any bands together until now. The formation of Fugazi in 1987, they were doing something yet again brand new and contributed a lot to the budding post-hardcore genre, which also has very heavy roots in DC. In addition to other contributors such as the wonderful Husker Du, love them. But Fugazi had this new approach. Ian MacKaye was essentially like, I want to focus less on being in a band and focus more on playing music. They started incorporating a lot of groove elements. They had Joe Lawley on bass, who has a wonderful tone, wonderful general contribution to the band. They had a wonderful rhythm section with Brendan Canty, who was in Rites of Spring. And then eventually, after being a three-piece for a little while they were sort of getting their stuff together, Guy Picciotto joins on backing vocals, and then eventually Pokemon evolves to being a second guitar player. So people, there had been these sort of like groovy, almost like reggae elements of punk since Bad Brains, but the Bad Brains had these sort of sporadic like reggae songs on their albums, but like wouldn't mix them with their punk output, and that's exactly what Fugazi did. So when they put out their self-titled EP, followed by the Margin Walker EP, people noticed, and people started paying attention really heavily. Because once again, for like the third time in a decade, the good people of the DC scene were doing something brand new and very exciting. This is my favorite Fugazi song, at the very least from the early years, before they started getting really weird, and we'll probably cover that in another episode. This is Suggestion. And that was Suggestion by Fugazi. That song is actually about an experience had by Amy Pickering, the aforementioned coiner of the event Revolution Summer. And you might have intuited that it's sort of about catcalling culture, sexual harassment, and that sort of thing. One of Fugazi's main mantras when it came to this new exciting band was being as upstanding about social topics as humanly possible. The album that song is from, the compilation, which is a combination of their two earliest EPs, which is collectively called 13 Songs, includes this song, which is about sexual harassment, a song about climate change, Burning 2, a song about the AIDS epidemic, Give Me the Cure, also very good, and just generally has a new approach to the socio-political climate that was not as present in a band like Minor Threat, who mostly sang about issues faced by teenagers. Like, all of my friends are doing drugs, and all of my friends are in toxic relationships. Relatable. So it was very meaningful when Fugazi hit the scene, because there was a lot of just rampant homophobia, as there was anywhere in the 80s. And Fugazi was very outspoken about being anti-racist, being anti-homophobia. They did almost all of the shows that they played in the DC area were benefit shows for things like AIDS clinics, women's clinics, shelters, that kind of thing. They were fantastic, and I will certainly be yapping more about them in a future episode. But I do believe that we are out of time for right now. And perhaps I do plan on doing another episode about emo music as a whole, because we only got to focus on it a little bit. And probably a bit more on the future of the DC scene as it gets into its post-hardcore phase, because we only got up to right before the 90s. The 90s were an insane era for the DC scene and Discord Records as an entity. They had a lot of really good releases, and we will almost certainly get to that. But in the meantime, I have been your host, Casey, and I'm here to tell you to keep your eyes open.